This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. This week, we are talking about how wildlife and their habitat are often used as currency to pay for our high standards of living and lower costs of energy. Also, how issues are very often only evaluated economically and not biologically. But we also have just a handful of news stories to go through from the week. In Montana, a judge just ruled in favor of Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks in a case where a private landowner group had sued the state for failing to kill enough elk. We talked about this in past episodes, how the United Property Owners of Montana, or UPOM, argued that the state was failing to manage elk at the appropriate management levels in many central Montana hunting districts. Many of the districts in question, the population is substantially over objective, but also most of the land where the elk are is private property. UPOM wanted the state to remove 50,000 excess elk in order to meet the management objectives. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks would be happy to facilitate hunter access onto the private land where the elk reside, and in fact even pay the landowner if they allow access. But according to UPOM, this was insufficient. They wanted the state to remove the elk, but were unwilling to provide access to the elk. To me, this seems like asking a mechanic to fix your car and forbidding them from touching your car. I assume what UPOM wanted is the ability for private landowners to freely kill as many elk as they wanted on their property. This is a huge contrast to what the North American model of wildlife conservation stands for, where wildlife are held in the public trust. Just because they cross onto your private property does not mean you own them. It's one of the biggest reasons we have abundant wildlife populations in the United States. Montana FWP already offers multiple tools to private landowners to help reduce elk, including block management, where they pay private landowners for hunter access, along with a game damage program where they will support hazing, putting out repellents, fencing, supplemental hunting permits, and game damage hunts. Because of this, the judge sided with FWP, stating that if the landowners are unwilling to participate in existing programs, they are not eligible for relief from the courts. This is definitely a win for public hunters. In Massachusetts, an Act Modernizing Firearm Laws was recently signed into law that will have significant impacts to hunters. Part of the package requires hunters to obtain a firearm identification card, which entails taking writing curriculum along with a live fire exercise from an approved instructor, along with registering their firearm. Another section of this bill prohibits non-residents from possessing a firearm within the state unless their state has a similar firearm identification card or permit. This means unless you're coming from a state that also has strict gun laws, it prohibits you from hunting with a gun in Massachusetts. The Congressional Sportsman Foundation voiced frustration with how this bill was passed, saying much of the discussion was conducted behind closed doors, leaving minimal time for anyone to review and voice their concern. They also mentioned how this creates a significant hurdle for resident hunters within the state to be able to comply with these new requirements. I could not find any numbers on how many non-resident licenses are sold each year in Massachusetts, but I would imagine that this bill will result in a significant loss of revenue for the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife. Update in Colorado, the proposal to ban mountain lion, lynx, and bobcat hunting within the state will indeed be on the ballot in November. In a past episode, we mentioned that this was likely to happen, but the Colorado Secretary of State office confirmed that the group did in fact collect enough signatures to get this on the ballot. As a reminder, the reintroduction of wolves in Colorado was also a result from a ballot measure that narrowly passed in 2020. Hunters now have their work cut out for them if they want to preserve the right to hunt mountain lions and bobcats in the state. Despite the fact that Colorado has robust populations of both lions and bobcats, it's going to be a tough sell to individuals who haven't experienced hunting and don't understand the benefits of the North American model. But it's going to be up to hunters to articulate that story and articulate it well if they want voters to oppose this ballot measure in November. The U.S. Fish Wildlife Service announced a voluntary pilot program to incentivize the use of non-lead ammo on National Wildlife Refuges. Lead has been shown to have negative effects on wildlife in a number of ways. Waterfowl have been poisoned from picking up lead shot while feeding. Because of this, lead ammo has been banned from waterfowl hunting for a long time. But also, lead fragments in hunter-killed big game animals have caused poisoning in scavenging birds. Because of this, the U.S. Fish Wildlife Service has had multiple proposals and rules implementing varying levels of lead bans on refuges, but there has been significant pushback as non-lead ammo is not always readily available, and often it's more expensive. So with this new pilot project, instead of having an outright ban, they are incentivizing the use of non-lead. They're starting with 7 different refuges where if you hunt on that refuge and submit proof of purchase for non-lead ammo, they will reimburse you for the cost. This follows a similar path of Arizona, Utah, and Oregon that have offered various incentives to reduce lead use, especially in certain areas, such as those known to have the endangered California condors. Also, this is what the North American Non-Lead Partnership has been advocating for with their campaign. Rather than implement bans, put voluntary programs in place that incentivizes use and educates about the impacts of lead on wild birds. With that, we're going to jump into our deeper dive where we're talking about how decisions are often made for short-term gains at the cost of our wildlife and land long term. Deeper dive today, the topic is kind of talking about paying our costs of high quality of living with currency being wildlife or their habitat, land. We like to pay the bill with wildlife and land.
Yep.
And
I've been on that kick lately. People are probably thinking, Newberg, you've lost your mind. I did a podcast with Doug Duran the other day, and we got on this topic about paying our own way.
Yeah.
And the land ethic of Leopold and the generational inheritance, either you add to that inheritance or you take away from it each generation.
Yeah. Should we expand on that before you continue a little bit about, like, what do you mean by the land ethic of Leopold?
Yeah, so if you read the Sand County Almanac, Aldo Leopold, who is considered the modern day, the father of modern day wildlife conservation.
For sure, yeah.
Wrote this series of essays that are accumulated in a Sand County Almanac. I've read it I don't know how many times, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners have. But in there, Leopold, he was very aware about the history of our country not having any bashful or remorse or other feelings for liquidating resources for the benefit of a higher cost of living. You know, bison and white-tailed deer, whatever, someone's going to make some money at it. We're going to lower some costs and increase some revenues.
Yeah, and that book was published in 1949.
1949.
So that was a while ago.
So his essays were written in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
So 80 or 90 years ago, he wrote this quote, and this has been with me since probably the first time I really read the almanac with an eye on how does this impact public lands, because a lot of his stuff is about private lands. But his quote says, "We face the question whether a still higher standard of living is worth its cost in things natural, wild, and free." In other words, for this higher standard of living, are we going to pay that with the currency of wildlife and habitat and clean air and clean water?
Right.
That's really the question he was asking. And he says, we face the question of whether this, and you think about our standard of living today compared to what it was when he probably wrote this in the 30s or 40s.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's astronomical. I mean, like,
he thought they were living big then.
Yeah, and now everyone has their own vehicle. Everyone's got a smartphone, a computer.
Yeah.
I mean, we're recording this on cameras.
Yeah.
We have lights. We have computers in front of us. We have phones in our pockets. We have this audio equipment. So, like, it's not like we're immune from this. Like,
No.
we are a part of this consumerism thing. But it's crazy to look at, like, compare that fact that he had that thought back then with, like, what we have now.
He saw so much happen in the name of quote unquote progress.
Right.
He saw a lot of this, his land ethic was heavily influenced by the Dust Bowl. He's talking about if we can't take care of our land, if we're letting it blow away and wash down the creek and down to the Gulf of Mexico, or he's like, who thinks this is a good idea? Well, he's also very smart in the terms of economics and a whole lot of other stuff. And I think that's why his writings, his essays, his challenges to us to be intellectually honest still are relevant today.
Oh, yeah.
And what got you and I on this topic today was the BLM just put out for public comment a 62,000 acre public land solar development.
Yeah. And as we've talked about solar in the past, when you put in a solar development, it's not like habitat degradation. It's habitat destruction. It's gone.
Done.
There is no public land. There's no use of it from a human. You can't go out there and play on it. You can't do anything. You can't ride your dirt bike. You can't hunt, fish, nothing.
Right.
It's just now a solar farm, which is part of the big green energy push. And it's kind of mind-boggling to think that it's just worth. And I'm sure it's a dry, desolate desert. Mm-hmm. But that being said, it's just
I've driven by there many times. It is.
But still, it's like it's still wildlife habitat.
It is.
And it's still open space. And we're not making any more open space.
Yeah.
Like, it's just like we can't make more land.
Yeah.
So once that starts, there's no going back.
Right. So it gets to this point, and I think the reason that Leopold's comment is so relevant for so many reasons, but we have on this Fresh Tracks Weekly, last week we talked about oil and gas, and everyone's like, you don't understand how, yeah, we understand how oil and gas works. Okay. But it was merely the fact of there's political interference.
Right.
To benefit one type of land use versus the other. And everyone's like, oh, you greenies, you go read the comments. People are like, I can see which side of the politics you are on. Well, no, I'm on the side of the politics of wild places and wild things. And I am, okay, can I just interject personal life experience here?
Yeah, go for it.
I am not convinced that either side, if you want to talk about this, all you people who commented that it's a left or a right, an R or a D, both sides are willing to pay with wildlife and wild places for whatever ideas of energy they're most vested in.
Oh, for sure.
Right here, we are looking at, we're going to pay with wildlife that we're going to pay with land and habitat that wildlife would enjoy and future generations yet unborn would enjoy, so that we can have, as Leopold called, the higher standard of living. In other words, lower cost energy.
Yeah.
And I love low cost energy. I mean, we benefit from it. This country benefits from it. But at what point do we say we're going to quit asking for the generational subsidy and pay our own freight, pay our own way?
Yeah. Well, now that was one of Leopold's big points, is that we always look at things in an economic sense. Mm-hmm. And people just struggle to look at things in a biological sense. Right. And just think about, there is more to life than just what, dollars and cents and what makes sense for the bottom line. Yep. It's like there's a lot, and I think a lot of people struggle with that. And I don't know, maybe I like to think that hunters and people who are outdoor recreationalists have more of a value towards that. They see that value a little more. Right. But then on both, like you said, both ends of the spectrum, they're willing to just forgo so much of that in the name of progress.
Right.
And again, we can't just stop progress. Like, no. We're going to have energy developments, right, like on both green energy and fossil fuels, like however you want to look at it, it's going to continue down both avenues for right. a long time.
And Leopold was very good at pointing out, you either pay for it out of your own pocket or you pay for it with the currency of wild things.
Right.
So it might cost a little more to accommodate wildlife. Okay, my power bill is 2 cents more at the end of the month.
Right.
My gas bill is 12 cents more each month. So you either pay for it there, or you pay for it by saying we're going to have lower quality standards. We're going to put a bunch of habitat up on the sacrificial altar. We're going to interject. We're not going to have free markets. We're not going to let conservation and wild space be part of the free market. We're going to go play favors for the green energy team or the fossil fuel energy team. And we're going to call it a free market. But really what we're doing is we're telling these checks that we're cashing are going to be covered by the wild things.
And future generations,
and future generations.
That's like the other big aspect to this. It's like, okay, right. Well, like what you're willing to stomach, but it compounds over the years. And it's just like
Yep.
what we've been able to enjoy in terms of going out and enjoy public lands. It's like at some point you just...
And Leopold, he talks about that also, about how he felt he inherited a legacy or whatever you want to call it. There was a lot that he inherited. And he questioned, are we adding more to it? So he kind of, and this is where it is easier to talk about a lot of things in numbers and finances and whatever, but he used some good analogies. And I've grabbed some of those, and the way I try to explain this is our wildlife is kind of like a bank account, right? You either add to it by conservation or you deplete it by doing things for your generation to have lower costs.
Right.
And pretty soon it's depleted.
Yeah, it's a short-term gain for long-term loss.
Right.
It's just like...
Because and I can say this because I'm old and gray, Marcus. My generation, we have depleted that bank account by paying so much of our standard of living with wildlife and wild places and wild things and habitat and air quality and everything else to the detriment of your generation and those yet unborn. Because all that stuff that gets developed, the Pinedale anticline is never going to be virgin mule deer and pronghorn habitat ever again.
Right.
But we wanted cheaper energy, my generation. So we said, that's the price we're willing to pay, as Leopold says, for this higher standard of living. In other words, a lower cost to get more resources. And I know a lot of people are like, Newberg, you are out in the weeds, man. You are off the rails. My point of this is every one of these decisions, whether it's the green energy thing or the fossil fuel things or hydro energy or whatever, they all come at a cost.
Right.
There are no free lunches, especially for the wild things. When you're doing this out on big landscapes, that's the reason that a lot of these places get thrown up there, right? Because no one lives nearby except the wild things.
Yeah.
That's the price we are paying. We convert wild things to a currency, so it's something we don't have to pay.
Yeah. And as I got to, put in there the counter argument too, that we export that demand to elsewhere, other countries, or, it's the classic not in my backyard argument.
Absolutely.
And so, I don't know, that's tough to handle, but I think, go ahead.
We hear the argument, well, then we won't be able to compete with whatever country in energy sale, in energy exports. Well, I don't want to denude my country the way some of those places have said, well, we don't care. We'll sell off everything. We'll destroy everything. We'll make it a parking lot.
Yeah.
When you have this global economy, saying that and looking at it in those terms says, okay, I guess I'm going to play by the same standards of how I value wild places and wild things as some other place. And we historically in the United States have said, no, we value those things. And so just seeing these things pop up. And I get so many folks, aren't you glad about all this green energy? Well, I'm glad that there's some benefits to it, but I'm willing to pay more for my green energy, if you want to call it that.
Right.
So we're not wiping out all this wildlife habitat.
Yeah.
The same as I said the same thing when other groups or other political campaigns were out there saying the same for fossil fuel energy. I need it, and I'm willing to pay more for it so that the damn elk and deer and sage grouse and songbirds and everything else don't have to write the checks or cover the checks that I'm cashing.
Right.
But
yeah, and we talked about this in the past, but with a lot of the clean energy or green energy developments going on public lands, it's like you hope that there's more incentives to put it into cities, on rooftops, on places where you can double down on infrastructure where you're not just. Right. But it's so incredibly cheaper right now. Mm-hmm. Like it's just, again, but this is looking at it from that purely economic standpoint. Mm-hmm. Public land, this desolate stuff in Nevada, that is way cheaper to develop and way easier to put a large-scale solar farm than it is to go on a bunch of warehouse roofs.
Yeah.
Then you got to pay a higher rent. You got to pay it's going to be a more difficult task. But it's just like, those are the things. It's like, well, can we as a society try to direct it to that direction rather than just like blowing up 62,000 acres?
Right.
That'll never get used again.
Yeah.
And that's like the hard part. That's where I don't know. It's a tough road.
It is, and a lot of people are gonna be like, so what's the deal with all this, Randy, Marcus? What's the deal? The point is, you can comment on every one of these things, and we need to be commenting about the wildlife issues, migration corridors, all the things that are impacted by green energy.
Yeah.
And how about mitigation? How about, okay, if you want to go destroy 62,000 acres of public land, you better go and improve 62,000 acres somewhere else.
Right.
And make that be a part of the cost of the project. Oh, well, the folks who are getting this energy in Southern California or Nevada or Arizona, it's going to cost them $0.10 a year for more energy.
Yeah.
So?
Yeah, the mitigation's a big part with hydropower. And, you have like a hydro dam go in and they have to pay a ton of mitigation money to improve habitat for fisheries or some sort of watershed management elsewhere because of that alteration that they've made by putting that dam in. Like that's a very, so I know maybe there is some mitigation stuff, but I haven't seen a lot of talk about it. If there is, with the green energy, it's all it's all celebration. Right. Wow, green energy. We're lowering our fossil fuels, which is like, and that's another aspect to it. It's like I get it, like lowering emissions. That's good. Like we're putting less stuff into the atmosphere, but it's just like, man, there is a lot of costs that I feel like are not being counted, in terms of wildlife and open space.
Absolutely. So in 2022, the Bureau of Land Management was happy to say we are cutting the rates for wind and solar leasing on public land. Just last week, we said, why should oil and gas get discounted rates? Why should we eliminate competition for conservation? Well, why are we doing the same thing?
Yeah.
Why do they need a rate cut? Other than people don't want to pay what they're supposed to pay.
Yeah.
Well, we'll make the wildlife pay for that.
Yep.
So the other point of all this is, if you're one of these folks who believe it's all this party or all that party or your guy's all perfect and that guy's all bad or whatever, no. They're both sides.
Yeah, I think
in these discussions,
whichever side gets elected with the, in terms of Congress or whatever, it's just like hold them accountable and like make sure that they're taking into account wildlife and habitat and open space.
Yeah,
that's right it doesn't matter which side.
You can go comment on this one in Nevada. The BLM is open for comment right now, and it's their press release. It's called the Esmeralda 7 Solar Project. And there's a ton more of them coming. I mean, if you look at how many are coming down the pike. Well,
there was proposed 22 million acres, right?
Available.
And
they said, well, we think only 697,000 of that 22 million will probably get developed. And only 48,000 of that will be in Nevada. Well, this one right here, 62,000. What happened to the 48,000 number you guys talked about a year ago?
Right. So just from right on the get-go, it's already exceeding the estimation. So
So please, folks, when these things come up, don't just go this side or that side. I'm all for this. I'm all for that. As Roosevelt said, the wildlife and its habitat cannot speak. We shall and we must. That's really the message of this. Because if we don't speak up and ask for consideration of migration corridors, winter range, habitat, all these other things, and ask for mitigation and mitigation and reclamation, the wildlife isn't going to get it unless we say so, or unless we ask it and demand it. So go and comment.
Well, thanks, Randy. That was insightful. There's
And
a lot to it.
And whenever you're doing getting in these arguments, these debates, just ask yourself, is this higher standard of living something we should be paying for in the form of all things wild, natural, and free, as Leopold said? Anyhow, I don't know that I've solved any problems, Marcus, but I sure feel good now.
Oh, yeah. Solved all the world's problems.
Oh, thanks for kind of poking the buttons here.
Oh, yeah.